Over the last 40 years, it is hard to imagine another medium of entertainment that has so thoroughly claimed a piece in both pop culture and outrage politics, like video games. Just as the moral crazes surrounding pinball machines, rock and roll, and communism was beginning to ramp down, video games came onto the scene, quickly ingraining themselves into pop culture as they became increasingly prevalent in society. But with any new form of technology, there are those who neither understand it nor have any real desire to. And perhaps video games could have escaped the notice of aging politicians if their graphical capabilities and their ability to create plot-heavy narratives and depict gruesome content never improved. However, companies quickly saw the mainstream appeal of video games and stirred themselves into quite a frenzy, each trying to win out in what would later be called console wars. In order to surpass the competition, companies began pouring massive amounts of money and manpower towards creating better graphical experiences. And with each new generation of video game consoles came graphical enhancements alongside better and more ambitious storytelling. The thing about stories, however, is that they tend to mature alongside their audience. When you were in elementary school, you might have read little stories like, "If you give a mouse a cookie." And those were great when you were, 4 years old and you had the reading comprehension of a fortune cookie. But if you sit down at age 24 and you try to lose yourself into deep narrative and world building of "If you give a mouse a cookie," you're going to end up disappointed. Why? Because you're at the age where you want your stories to be more meaningful. You want them to create labyrinths of worlds you're happy to lose yourself in. And these worlds tend to look more like ours, warts and all. In fact, the deepest stories tend to be the ones that have something to say about the world in which we find ourselves, and all the sin and darkness involved in it. Video games provide a very captivating medium for these types of experiences because they allow the player to be fully involved in the progression of the story like no other medium truly can. It's precisely how a game like Spec Ops: The Line allows the player to experience a modern-day retelling of Heart of Darkness and take place in the madness themselves as an unreliable narrator experiencing PTSD. Or it's how a game like Metal Gear Solid 5: The Phantom Pain can be a misunderstood anti-war masterpiece based off of Moby Dick and full of criticism for warfare and nuclear weapons. This medium allows for storytelling like no other. Needless to say, not everyone sees that as a positive. The concept of anyone playing a video game in which you are personally the driving force of a mature story with violence is going to raise eyebrows, particularly with those in charge of stewarding our society. Conservative forces, not necessarily Republican, have always questioned new cultural developments, and video games have never been excluded from that. With the medium's continued graphical advancement and global popularity, concerns about the potential negative impact of video games have also grown. In response to these concerns, the Entertainment Software Ratings Board, or ESRB, was created in 1994 as a form of self-regulation from the industry and introduced a parental rating system for video games. The intended goal of the ESRB was to provide parents with information about the content in video games and to placate the federal government that was becoming increasingly critical of the medium in the early 1990s. Whether the board has been effective in this goal or in any other capacity is debatable, however. Ultimately, our research question is this: has the ESRB been effective in its goals as a self-regulating body for the video game industry in order to prevent media controversies, restrictive regulations, and links to gun violence? We argue that it has not been. We hypothesize that the independent variable that serves as the most plausible explanation for this continued assault on artistic expression within video games is conservative ideology, more specifically those related to the moral majority that gained a massive amount of cultural and political influence and has continued to shape the country since the 1970s. The research design for this study will be a case study analysis of 3 separate shooter games that were released in the 21st century after the creation and implementation of the ESRB. Specifically, we will be conducting a qualitative analysis of the effects of conservative politics on cultural and political reactions to violent video games based on these 3 case studies. Our 3 specific cases consist of Grand Theft Auto: San Andreas, JFK Reloaded, and Call of Duty: Modern Warfare 2. These games generated negative media controversy when they released within the news cycle and across the political spectrum for issues such as gun violence and conservative moral values. These games are all shooters, played from either the first-person or third-person perspective, and as such contain mature depictions of violence. Of course, some would call them gratuitous. They will allow us to analyze the reaction to violent video games as storytelling, and more importantly, their place in politics and in America's cultural framework. Additionally, for the purpose of this essay, conservative does not necessarily refer to Republican, but refers to the subject holding more old-fashioned views surrounding American culture and the impact of digital violence on real society. Our first game is Grand Theft Auto San Andreas, released in 2004. Describing the game as a violent one would be kind of an understatement. The game, developed by Rockstar North, allowed players to assume the role of Carl Johnson, otherwise known as CJ, on a journey to avenge the murder of his mother, protect his community from rival gangs, and consolidate the power of the fictional Grove Street family syndicate, all the while engaging in various illicit activities himself, including robbery, carjacking, and murder. The game was the first in the series to try to parallel the real world in its setting, breaking ground for the series in that way, having CJ's journey take him across the three cities of Los Santos, San Fierro, and Las Venturas, representing the real-life Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Las Vegas in a fictionalized 1992. Meanwhile, it is commonly assumed by the gaming community that CJ's gang, the Grove Street families, were based off the very real group known as Crips, an African-American street gang from Los Angeles, with their main rivals the Ballas, based off the Bloods. The game's climax arrives when the whole of Los Santos becomes engulfed in violent riots after a corrupt government official is acquitted from a corruption charge, a clear echo of the Rodney King riots that engulfed Los Angeles in the same year the game takes place in. All in all, Grand Theft Auto San Andreas creates a world in which a flawed protagonist and the player through them experiences a very exaggerated caricature of what urban life in America was like during this tumultuous time, using historical parallels to ground a violent and surreal story. The game was also the most expansive and ambitious game of the series up until that point. San Andreas featured the largest map the series had seen, building off the worlds of Grand Theft Auto 3 and sequel Grand Theft Auto Vice City. With this increase in size came an increase in player autonomy, allowing players freedom of gameplay that was groundbreaking in its time and still impressive now. CJ could do the standard GTA fare of running every single red light, killing civilians for looking at him funny, or hiring any prostitute. But San Andreas went further in creating a lived-in parody of America by including regular activities like working out at the gym, getting a haircut, shopping for clothes, all the while listening to very contemporary-sounding radio stations with surreal ads. The player could talk to NPCs across the entire city who had their own anecdotes and even interacted with each other, completely separate from the player. The world GTA San Andreas had created was one that felt grounded in reality, despite how bombastic and absurd it could get. It was more than just a microcosm of urban America. It was a carnival based on it too. San Andreas was pretty much destined to be controversial upon release due to the series' penchant for violence and criminal behavior. However, what became known as the Hot Coffee mod took the controversy to a new level. The mod actually hacked the game's code to let players access an explicit sexual minigame that had been hidden by the game's code by the developers. Importantly, this minigame was actually impossible to access normally, and was only ever made public through hackers accessing leftover activity that was never intended for public release. Needless to say, that defense did not satisfy most. Like never before, San Andreas outraged parents, politicians, and media outlets, who argued that the extremely violent game was now also promoting sexual content to minors. A media firestorm was sparked, with news outlets covering the controversy extensively. Amidst this controversy, the ESRB quickly re-rated the game from mature to adults only, which meant that retailers who did not sell AO-rated games, practically all of them, had to pull the game from their shelves. In response, Rockstar was forced to patch the game on Windows and re-release new copies of the games removed for console, costing them millions of dollars and months of sales. Due to its graphic content, GTA San Andreas received considerable backlash across the political spectrum as well. Then Senator Hillary Clinton declared that she would introduce a congressional bill that would make it a federal crime for stores to sell violent or sexually explicit video games to individuals under the age of 18, and called for the FTC to have more authority to regulate video games based on hidden content. This bill became known as the Family Entertainment Protection Act and was co-sponsored by Democratic Senators Joe Lieberman and Evan Vaughn. On her motivations for introducing the censorship bill, Senator Clinton stated, "I have developed legislation that will empower parents by making sure their kids can't walk into a store and buy a video game that has graphic, violent, pornographic content." Senator Lieberman went even further on calling video games problematic, saying, "Without evidence, there is a growing body of evidence that points to a link between violent video games and aggressive behaviors in children. We are not interested in censoring videos meant for adult entertainment, but we do want to ensure that these videos are not purchased by minors." Ultimately, the bill expired in committee at the end of 2006, never having made it onto the floor. However, the House of Representatives, in an overwhelming 355 to 21 vote in favor, passed a resolution backing a federal investigation of Take-Two Interactive. The next shooter we will look at is JFK Reloaded, a digitally released 2004 British indie game that's a first-person shooter that recreates the assassination of President John F. Kennedy from the perspective of Lee Harvey Oswald. The game's sole objective and victory condition is to successfully recreate the shooting as found by the Warren Commission's findings. The player must have their first shot miss the car, the second hit Kennedy in the neck, and John Connolly in the chest, and the third finally delivering the coup de grace to poor JFK in order to get a perfect score of 1,000. In the event that the player strays from historical events, the player's score is deducted if any additional individuals are killed or they perform the assassination inadequately. It was also released on the 41st anniversary of the tragedy that it was simulating. The game featured a precise physics engine that was impressive for the time and for the capabilities of the small development team, with the intent to actually disprove the conspiracy theories that Lee Harvey Oswald had a collaborator by simulating how it was indeed possible to land 3 shots at the president's limo from that location. The game itself was never submitted to the ESRB, so it received no rating and subsequently did not open itself to any pre-release backlash. Ultimately, the game was a European's attempt to use the widening scope of video games to depict a historical event, all the while attempting to discredit conspiracy theorists. Shockingly, this game was not positively received by the media and prompted significant and overwhelming bipartisan criticism and translated into political action. Any defense made by the developer after the game's release was completely drowned out by the outrage of American citizens and the politicians. A spokesperson for Ted Kennedy summed out how Kennedy's family felt on the matter, saying, "It's despicable. There's really no further comment." On the other side of the political spectrum, then Representative John Kasich also condemned the game in his book, stating that the word despicable did not even begin to describe it, while taking the opportunity to attack the video game industry for indulging in such content. Given the widespread political agreement that JFK Reloaded was despicable material, then the government moved to act against the industry. Illinois Governor Ron, I'm not even going to pretend to know how to say this, Blagojevich, in a town hall meeting with concerned parents, said this about the matter: "I watched that and felt a great deal of outrage and contempt and thought to myself, someone ought to do something about that. And then it dawned on me, I'm the governor. I can do something about that." These words summed the moral values, personal indignation, and a spirit of censorship that would make history a year later when Illinois became the first state in the United States to legally prohibit the sale of violent video games to minors. This "won't somebody think of the children" mentality at play here spread like wildfire in state legislatures, with the states of California, Georgia, Louisiana, Maryland, Michigan, Minnesota, Oklahoma, and Washington all following Illinois' example in curtailing the sale of violent or sexually explicit video games. It became quite clear that the political atmosphere across the country was gonna let First Amendment concerns take a backseat to protecting minors from images of virtual violence. Beyond state attempts at regulating the sale of video games, the Massachusetts House of Representatives sent the developer an official letter of condemnation signed by Ted Kennedy himself, effectively cementing the developer's reputation. Of course, something worth mentioning is that the state laws that were passed after the release of both JFK Reloaded and San Andreas were all deemed unconstitutional in federal courts and none remain in effect today. A few years later, the video game industry had changed once again, with the release of the 7th generation of consoles with the PS3 and the Xbox 360 ushering a new era of graphical fidelity. During this time period, the Call of Duty series exploded in popularity with the release of Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare, a story that bucked the World War II shooter trend in the industry in favor of telling a realistic story grounded in modern combat. The story received several accolades, and the entry was seen and recognized as groundbreaking for its time, and Thus, the pressure was on for Activision and the development studio in charge of the project, Infinity Ward, to create a worthy sequel, Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2. Continuing from where the first game left off, tensions between the US and Russia escalated significantly, with an ultra-nationalist Russian terror cell fanning the flames in the hopes of starting what they see as a righteous World War III. This terror cell, led by the series' main antagonist Vladimir Makarov, decided to launch a false flag operation that would bring about a Russian invasion of the US midway through the game. This false flag operation turns out to be a mass shooting at a Russian airport, killing dozens of innocent civilians while using American weapons and speaking English, with the intent to frame the US as responsible and use Russian indignation to justify an invasion. The terrorist attack succeeds, the United States is successfully framed, and Makarov gets the Third World War that he wanted. The player hear all about this in a news article or an in-game cutscene? No. The player character is actually put in control of one of the gunmen carrying out the airport massacre. For the first time, the player at home was able to commit a literal mass shooting in the virtual world of a AAA game. All the while, it hadn't even been a decade since the September 11th attacks had made terrorism a reality for the American people. Infinity Ward included this mission within the game's storyline and approved it for release, knowing very well the controversy that would emerge from it. For them, the controversy was the point. It was exactly what they were going after. The game's scriptwriter, Jesse Stern, stated that No Russian was written because he wanted to make something upsetting, disturbing, but also something people could relate to, as they put it, as close as possible to atrocity. For them to tell a narrative that could go toe-to-toe with cinema, Infinity Ward felt that No Russian was necessary to depict what could happen in the 21st century. There are no penalties to skipping it, an intentional design choice to not punish players for not wanting to be complicit in such an act. It should also be emphasized that at no point is the player actually given any on-screen instructions to participate in the massacre. Rather, the mission's sole directive is follow Makarov's lead. As such, the player has the option of completing the task without shooting a single bystander, merely absorbing the horror of the level. Notably, even with this level included, the ESRB rated Modern Warfare 2 M for mature and did not give it an adults-only rating. Once again, the media pounced on the opportunity to cover the controversial mission, which concerned parents and politicians once more. For many, the mere fact that the game allowed players to engage in an act of terrorism was too inappropriate and offensive for it to ever be allowed in children's hands. Fox News, fair and balanced as always, covered the game during a segment of Fox and Friends, where a host said this: "You bring a violent game into a house with an 8-year-old, nothing to stop that kid from playing it and becoming a terrorist." So now not only were kids at risk of seeing violence, they were at risk of becoming actual terrorists because Dad bought himself Modern Warfare 2 for Christmas. Turning this outrage into action, Representative Joe Baca of California introduced the Video Games Health Labeling Act of 2009, which would put a warning on every video game with a teen rating or above, the same way cigarette packets do. In their eyes, the influence of video games was just as dangerous of a threat as the very real danger of actual smoking. Joe Lieberman, never one to miss an opportunity to attack video games when he could, even tried linking shooters like Call of Duty to the Sandy Hook shooting. With no actual evidence linking the franchise to the mass shooting, Lieberman nevertheless dug in and grandstanded, stating very often these young men have an almost hypnotic involvement in some form of violence in our entertainment culture, particularly violent video games, and then they obtain guns and become not just troubled young men, but mass murderers. Indeed, an interesting bipartisan trend that has emerged alongside the release of these games is the subsequent blaming of them by politicians to deflect the conversation away from gun control after the latest mass shooting. This trend has not gone away in the last couple election cycles either. After the Sandy Hook shooting, the NRA specifically targeted violent video games as the cause of the tragedy, always more than ready to blame imaginary guns rather than actual ones. After the Daytona shooting in 2019, then Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy blamed the dehumanizing aspects of shooters, teaching children to kill, as the reason why mass shootings had become commonplace. Similarly, after the El Paso massacre, President Trump stated that Americans needed to stop the glorification of violence in society, which he followed up by saying, "This includes the gruesome and grisly video games that are now commonplace." As seen in both the laws passed by state legislatures and the federal bills proposed, When legislators have had the opportunity to try to limit the reach of violent video games, they took it. First Amendment concerns be damned. And if they can't pass any laws regulating, they will sure try to blame them for all society's ills. Never mind the fact that the American Psychological Association has repeatedly insisted that there is no evidence to suggest that there is any causal or correlational connection between playing violent video games and actually committing violent activities. The link is just not there. From a sheer numbers perspective, it's just not there either. Recent data suggests that 87% of Generation Z and 83% of millennials play some form of video games on a weekly basis. The battle royale shooter Fortnite has over 200 million active players a month. If video games truly were this corrupting influence on today's youth, you wouldn't be able to go for a walk nowadays without encountering a mass shooter just waiting to go ballistic. Despite the outrage, video games as a medium have not suffered. On the contrary, the video game industry has never been more profitable. Even with the controversy and the recall San Andreas faced, the game was extremely profitable, becoming a commercial success, and the series has continued with 2 mainline entries since then. Likewise, Modern Warfare 2 was only another entry in a franchise that has consistently topped charts every year and is now on its 19th entry, which coincidentally is actually a remake of the very same Modern Warfare 2. However, if violent video games are to continue existing as forms of creative expression, it will be through the continued cooperation of America's judicial system. On the one hand, gamers and free speech advocates have long argued that the medium should be and is constitutionally protected by the First Amendment. They argue that video games, like film or television, are a developing form of creative expression that shouldn't be subject to censorship or regulation. On the other hand, opponents of mature content in video games have long argued that its mature content is troubling and has the potential to harm people. Any desire they could have to see freedom of speech applied to video games immediately dissipates when they're affronted with what they argue is glorified violence, sexual activity, and criminal behavior, as they believe it could desensitize young Americans to the consequences of such behavior. For them, such content is not storytelling. It's just offensive and inappropriate with no artistic or literary merit. Importantly, despite the ESRB's efforts to prevent controversies, lawsuits, and restrictive regulations through its rating system, these controversies have continued to occur. Since the ESRB's inception, games that were controversial on the basis of their content continued to see attacks from political forces in regard to freedom of speech. However, up to this point, the judicial system has been sympathetic to free speech advocates. The US Supreme Court has actively protected the right of video games to exist as a form of expression entitled to First Amendment protection. In Brown v. Entertainment Merchants Association, the court's decision explained, like the protected books, plays, and movies that preceded them, video games communicate ideas and even social messages through many familiar literary devices and through features distinctive to the medium. That suffices to confer First Amendment protection. Through the Brown decision, the Supreme Court struck down a Californian law that forbid the renting or selling of violent video games to children without an adult present. In the face of accusations that young people might replicate violent crimes due to video games, the court explicitly affirmed that government doesn't have the right to restrict the ideas to which children may be exposed. Additionally, back in 2003, the 8th Circuit Court of Appeals affirmed an additional right to video games by overturning an ordinance from St. Louis County that restricted children's access to graphically violent video games. This Court of Appeals ruled that the First Amendment protects entertainment just as much as it protects political speech, and that violent video games do not provide a sufficient harm to psychological health for their constitutional protections to be curtailed. In effect, just as legislatures were trying to regulate violent video games, the court system served as a barricade to protect the interests of the First Amendment. That there is historical precedent protecting the content within video games is not disputable. What is disputable is whether the ESRB has played any role in protecting video games. The First Amendment explicitly protects freedom of speech, which includes video games as a form of expression. However, federal, state, and local initiatives have continually and consistently sought to curtail these protections against violent video games without so much as a second glance towards the ESRB. Now, one may ask, why does this matter? Video games may be of no importance to you, and you've never really cared about them, and you question why they warrant seeking political perspectives on them. However, what happens to video games could very well be a forerunner of attacks against other forms of medium, such as music or film. It is no secret that the Supreme Court has shifted significantly to the right in the last few years, and that it is perfectly comfortable disregarding precedent from earlier decisions. As such, the current judicial makeup of the Supreme Courts and other lower courts, after President Trump's judicial push, suggests that conservative efforts to censor and regulate contents within video games will be part of a larger cultural and political effort. The Brown decision may have been done with a strong majority of the Supreme Court, but one of the dissenters is Clarence Thomas, who remains on the court and has taken on a much larger role within the court's decisions since a majority started agreeing with him. Ultimately, it may be too early to say that the Supreme Court's protection of controversial media will continue to persist. In conclusion, while the ESRB has made efforts to provide parents with information about the content of video games and prevent government intervention, these controversies continue to happen. The existence of the ESRB in providing a rating system to inform parents has not influenced state and federal initiatives regarding the erosion of First Amendment protections one bit. Even as games such as San Andreas, JFK Reloaded, and Call of Duty continue to shock and disgust them, they and the rest of the video game industry were the subject of severe attacks by political forces who wanted to rectify imaginary violence with a very real limitation on American freedoms. Luckily, they remain protected under judicial precedent, at least for now. As video games continue to evolve and become more realistic and complex, the judgment of the ESRB, the limits of government intervention, and the vision of what the First Amendment means will continue to be important topics for creative expression as a whole.